We walk these streets every day, but we don't often think about all the people throughout history who have stood in the very same places we stand today. There are centuries of history in our little town with thousands of people walking its streets every day. What was it like for these people? For my capstone project, I wanted to get a better understanding of what life was like for African Americans in early Windsor, Vermont. Our town has never had much diversity. A look at census data from the late 18th century and early 19th century shows this, but there were still a number of people of color living in Windsor from the very beginning. In 1800, for example, Windsor had more people of color living in it than any other town in Vermont. I wondered what life was like for these early African Americans, living in a state with the earliest constitution to outlaw slavery, but still at a time when racism and slavery were very much the norm. I was inspired by the story of an enslaved woman named Dinah. Not much is known about her life, but we do know that she was sold to an attorney named Stephen Jacob in 1783 and was brought to his home in Windsor, where slavery was very much illegal. Stephen Jacob was an attorney and judge who served as the first district attorney for the District of Vermont and also as a judge on the Vermont Supreme Court. After serving Stephen Jacob and many other town residents for years, Dinah fell ill. She left the household of Stephen Jacob, and the responsibility to care for her fell on the town, as they were the stewards of the poor. At one point, the town actually attempted to force her out of town, but she stubbornly refused to leave, and the residents of the town continued to take care of her, the town reimbursing them. When she became too much of a burden, the town sued Stephen Jacob, claiming that because she was still his slave, he had a responsibility to take care of her. For evidence, they presented the bill of sale. The case went to the Vermont Supreme Court, and Jacob had to recuse himself from his own case. Ultimately, it was ruled that because Dinah could not have legally been a slave, Jacob had no responsibility to her. Although she was not legally a slave, she was a de facto slave, and the court did nothing to address this. It is possible, if not for this trial, we would not know about this case of de facto slavery. There are many more examples of this occurring in Vermont, and it is possible that there are other cases that are yet unknown. Although Dinah could not have legally been held as a slave, the fact remains that she was. While Stephen Jacob was an influential judge and a part of our town's history, it should be remembered he went against the very Constitution as a judge he was meant to uphold. And while we should remember his positive contributions, Dinah, a woman who was enslaved in Vermont, should not be forgotten. Dinah eventually died and was given a burial by the town. Despite all the hardships she must have had to endure in her life, she died free. She fought hard and was clearly not willing to let the town forget about all of her years of service when she fell ill. It's an important story for us to remember. The first census was in 1790, and this is some of the earliest records we can find on people of color in this town. On early censuses, all free people of color are listed in one category as opposed to white people, who are grouped by age and gender depending on the census. The first censuses also only listed the heads of household, so finding the names would be difficult. There were several black families listed in the census around this time, as well as black residents of households with a white head of household. These people would most likely have been servants, possibly apprentices. If they were younger, they would not necessarily have had to been free. Households that had black servants would have had a lot of wealth and power, as is in the case of Stephen Jacobs. There are two merchants in towns with ties to the West Indies with people of color listed as household members. These include William Leverett and Zabina Curtis. We do not know any details, so not much can be said about this, but we do know a bit about Zabina Curtis, though. He was born in Connecticut. He was a general of the Vermont militia. a state representative, and a merchant. In his will, he actually left a yearly sum of money to a woman named Phoebe Jensen, who was the person of color listed in his household on the census. Her grave can be found in the Old South Church Cemetery. This is in contrast to how Stephen Jacob did not provide for Dinah when she fell ill. On a side note about the censuses, no slaves would have ever been recorded in any Vermont census because, well, slavery was illegal. However, strangely, there appear to be 16 slaves listed in the totals for the 1800 census, despite no individual household reporting any slaves. An important part of Windsor's history is that the Vermont Constitution was signed here in this Windsor Tavern in 1777. Although Vermont was not yet a state, the Constitution was the first to outlaw slavery in what would become part of the United States. However, the Vermont Constitution was not as perfect in this regard as one might like to think. According to the wording, anyone under the age of majority could still be enslaved. There was no specific protection against unpaid labor, as it only prohibited someone from laboring against their will. Because of this, people could certainly find loopholes to exploit to continue slavery after adulthood, or to claim a slave was working of their own free will. Perhaps this is why Stephen Jacob got away with what he did. He could simply claim that Dinah continued working for him on her own free will. After all, she was in a free state and could not legally be enslaved. She could leave at any time. The story of slavery and racial discrimination in Vermont is not as nice and clean-cut as some people would like to think. There are many more cases of slavery and prejudice than I have talked about here, and many more that have likely been lost to history. It's important to remember this history if we are to examine how people of color are treated in this community. I myself am not a person of color and cannot speak for what it is like for people of color in this community. All I can do is try to learn the most I can. If you would like to know more about this, I encourage you to check out my sources in the description, and especially the book The Problem of Slavery in Early Vermont, 1777 to 1810 by Harvey, Amani, Whitfield. I would like to thank Sarah Rooker from Flow of History, Judy Hayward from Historic Windsor, and James Haaf for helping me with my research. Thank you so much for watching.